is to make our own attempt in understanding the different factors and drivers that kind of cause migration. We shall also be understanding like multiple trends in relation to the economic, social, climatic factors. And we'll also be discussing the challenges in different areas. And of course, anticipate the trends in the coming 21st century, come up with policy solutions, innovations in under one frame. But we'll be dividing it into two panels, which will focus on specific concerns individually. So the first panel would focus on providing a more theoretical collection and understanding of the drivers and the trends and the causes of migration. The second panel would present the challenges that are faced in such areas and basically brainstorm policy and innovative solutions, and of course, anticipating the whole trends. We feel that it's just going to be very easy for ideas to float around in this particular manner, and for the audience to also understand it in a much better way. Just a heads up that the chat box would be open towards the last 30 minutes of the session. And we would request you to post your questions, post your thoughts, and make full use of the chat box during that time. Till then, I guess we can all just relax back and hear our panelists, listen to their views, listen to their thoughts, and basically collect the questions and the ideas. And then perhaps in the last 30 minutes, just post them here on the chat box, which we'll be taking up then and there. It's indeed my pleasure to invite panelists this evening. And we're glad to say that we have a full house today with 10 young and bright minds, all ready to present their ideas and perspectives on this topic today. They are our current and past GPODS fellows, and the GPODS is, of course, a 3-month fellowship that not just aims to provide a thorough knowledge and understanding in the field of global policy, international diplomacy, and environmental sustainability, but it also provides with different horizons and perhaps even wings through our fellows to explore different dimensions. The details of which and the details about the GPODS fellowship would, of course, be circulated here in the chat box from time to time. And we'll request you to please check out our website and pages. I see that we're also going live on Facebook. So I think it would be a nice idea to maybe just ring in your friends and colleagues to join us in this conversation and be a part of it. I must emphasize on the fact that this time we have the best of the best panelists with us, who are all coming from different backgrounds and a mixed bag, perhaps, as I like to call it, because they have different experiences and perspectives. And the idea is to get all of that on board here in this discussion. I think all right. So, sorry. There are, of course, the present and the future policy enthusiasts and change leaders, environmentalists over here. And I think they have assumed it as their responsibility to voice out their opinions and share with us their thoughts over here in this panel. I think a quick round of introductions. We have Vidhi, who is, of course, a government affairs coordinator. And she's, of course, going to bring in the economics point of view with us over here on this panel. Sulekha, she has a master's from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies. Swasti, she is a senior consultant at Deloitte. Anshika Shrivastava has a postgraduate in climate change and sustainability studies. Parikshit, he is an expert in mathematics, actuarial sciences, and analytics. Asma, who has worked as research analyst at Deloitte. Krishna Priya, who's a lawyer, and she has some massive experience in the field of oil and gas sector. Marie, she's a political and sustainability scientist, and she's currently working as the research analyst at Center for Youth and International Studies. Neha, who's also who's a mechanical engineer, and she's currently working at the Climate Collective. And of course, Nipun, who's a lawyer in the making in the coming couple of years, perhaps. All right. So without wasting any more time, I feel that we'll be moving on with our first panel. And just to give a little background on that, We do know that now the human world has always been on the go, and so migration has kind of always been there ever since the existence of humankind. We have witnessed massive trends of migration where economic, social, political, and perhaps even climatic factors have been the main causes that have pushed people to migrate to other regions. A series of favorable, unfavorable, or even neutral factors, they cause migration. Factors that determine why a person migrates are related to the place of residence from where the migration starts, also known as the origin, and the place of new settlement where the migration ends, either completely or temporarily, can also be known as the destination. There have been multiple facets that make migration possible. The favorable attributes of a location are the pull factors, which attract a person, like employment opportunities, better standard of living. And the other forces, which are known as the push factors, they compel a person to move away. For example, they could be like unemployment or even poverty. It is important to understand that there are many, many layers in between that as well. In between them as well. And we need to understand all sorts of perspectives from a 360 round degree angle. And so we'll be delving into them without any further ado. I would like to invite Vidhi over here on this panel now to maybe share her thoughts, reflect on the different drivers in regards to migration and the different ways in which they are configured as well. And I'm sure she's going to open this whole box of understanding this economics background. We'll be expecting some talks in and around the economic causes and impacts as well. And so I think I would maybe just pass on the virtual mic to you, Vidhi.
Thank you, Srishti. Thank you for setting the context well. I'll share my screen. Meanwhile, hello, everyone. I hope everybody is keeping safe and fine. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, yes, we can.
Just a second. Yep. So, to begin with, over the last 2 decades, consensus has been reached that there are forces which lead to the inception of migration and to the perpetuation of movement. And these can be understood as you broadly named as drivers of migration. And to put it simply for everybody, drivers are the factors which get migration going and keep it going once begun. And explanations of the inceptions and perpetuations of these migration are focused on disparities in conditions between different places. And these disparities can be economic, social, political, cultural, environmental, and immediate factors. But for a better understanding, I've put these, let's just categorize them broadly and then see the distinctions. So the first factor of migration is predisposing factors. These contribute to the creation of context in which migration is more likely. And these examples include structural disparities between places of migrants' origin and destination shaped by the broader macro-political economy. And these processes and change, urbanization, and another broad demographic transformation, if you can put it like that. Economic disparities between territories sending and receiving migrants include earnings, livelihoods, living standards shaped by the unfolding of broader global political economy, and its inequities is I think the key word here. What might be called political disparity, it includes relative prevalence of conflict, persecution, dimensions of human rights, human security, and these are often associated with trends of nation building and disintegration in regions of migration's origin. Environmental disparities, on the other hand, are between sending and receiving territories that include presence or absence of resources, relative fertility of the soil, water availability, and maybe extent of forest covers broadly. And there can be geographical factors too, which play a role here. And so a point which can be highlighted here is some of our components, most of these components in predisposing factors are quantifiable, such as differentials in income per capita, in per capita expenditure on health, education, in number of health workers per capita, and or relative level of schooling or school enrollments and so on, such factors that are quantifiable. So the economic, political, and environmental arenas might be grouped as disparities which predispose people to migrate. That's one. Second factor is proximate factors that have more direct bearing on migration and derive from the working out of structural features that I just spoke about in the predisposing one. In regions of origin, they include manifestations such as downturn in the economic or business cycle has gone down, it is a downturn. A turn for the worse in the security, human rights, environments, and usually generated by power struggles or other example would be large-scale development projects that involve displacements, marked environmental degeneration, effects of climate change, etc. And in places of destination, proximate factors might include like the opposite of it, opportunities that open up as a result of economic upturn or wider societal improvements, such as new employment opportunities, chance to set up a business, better environment to set up a business or to persuade trade, or new educational openings, opportunities. But there is a obvious overlap with some of the elements of the structural domain that we talked about. And some of the features, again, to some extent are quantifiable. And maybe the economic arena probably more quantifiable so than the other factors. And this domain includes particular manifestations of economic, political, and environmental disparities again. The third factor is precipitating factor. And these factors are those that usually trigger the departure. And this may be in the arena of individual or household decisions where they actually decide that whether to stay put or whether to move. The precipitating factors may be in the economic sphere again, such as financial collapse, unemployment, factory closure, or rise in or collapse in farm prices, imposition of taxes, or disintegration of health, education services, or any welfare services that we usually get. Or they may be, these can be also located in a political or a security sphere, which includes disputed citizenship, escalation of conflicts, outbreaks of war, etc., etc. Both arenas are again in some dimensions, I would say, bring in human security concept. Then again, other example is natural and environmental disasters, earthquakes, floods. These also precipitate the movements of population. Again, there is a strong relationship with proximate factors, but unlike the previous two domains, I'd like to highlight that precipitating factors are often not so much measurable or observable. While they usually occur in places of origin, they may come about in places of destinations as well. So if we take example of COVID currently, we can classify it as a precipitating factor of migration. Fourth factor is mediating factor. Mediating factor can enable, facilitate, constrain, accelerate, and arguably maybe they may diminish migration too. Facilitating factors include the presence or quality of transport or the resources that are needed for the journey or for the transit period when you're moving from the one place to another. So those are the facilitating factors or the resources that you need. So constraining factors include absence of such infrastructure or the lack of such resources that are needed to move. And the migration regime, as we know, which embraces the efforts of national and international organizations to manage migration, has a mediating function. The influence of the panoply of policies governing immigrations, border crossing is, I believe, is subject to much debate. But policies and practice in other spheres, such as trade, education, agriculture, welfare, housing, are also likely to play a role here as factors of enabling also and constraining migration, either way. And a related factor to all these is a culture of migration that can arise among people and communities who have become habituated to mobility. These components are again much less subject to measurement, and some are then, like proximate factors are more measurable or quantifiable than mediating factors. In this domain of enablement or constraint, volumes, forms, migrations can be determined or shaped. If the decision to move is determined by precipitating factors, the decisions how and when to leave, which household member should go, where to, are shaped by these mediating factors. And they can be conceived as shaping the degree of maybe risk that is encountered while somebody decide to migrate. And combination of these predisposing, proximate, precipitating, and mediating drivers or factors or forces, however you want to put it, shape the conditions and circumstances within which people have a choice whether to move or to stay put, or sometimes that decision is thrust upon them. So I will rest my case here on the factors of migration and give the virtual mic back to you. Happy to answer any questions in the chat box later.
Of course. And I think I would encourage each and every panelist as well to maybe just speak up their thoughts as well, in case you feel that you wish to maybe make a supporting thought and support the idea of that person. I think I'll be encouraging that throughout. The idea is to just make it as lively and as interactive as we can. Thank you so much, Vivi, for really actually opening up the whole box of migration for me and for literally making my task really easy. Thank you so much for that. I think I'll now come to Sulekha, who of course was very keen on bringing her perspective and shedding some light on the popular culture of migration. And I think I'll ask her to maybe briefly touch on the different drivers in regards to healthcare, and perhaps specifically talk about them. And I'm sure we'll be needing more pointers on a different piece of understanding from you. And I'll come back to you later then, perhaps. And so over to you, Sulekha, please.
Thank you, Shrishti. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Very much loud and clear.
So I actually would like to thank Vidhi for making a very overarching and giving us the structure of different sorts of drivers, the classification of how you would put different types of migration, and that actually gives rise to different categories of people. So for example, you will have internally displaced people in terms of people who are forced to move in case of natural disasters, or let's say crop failures, which are increasingly common, unfortunately, due to climate change. And then you have refugees from war, which would require, and me having an international law background, we understand how closely related these categories tend to be, but the legalities of it make it extremely difficult for classification. And especially in the case of urban-rural migration, these factors, these driving factors, these legal structures tend to be more of a difficulty than an enabler. And why I say that is, it is a very complex problem. There are socio-economic overlays to all these drivers. So I would go in terms of more and push and pull factors. So the reason why we today are talking about urban-rural migration is not that it's an uncommon happening. Like Shrishti mentioned in her introduction, it's been happening since biblical times. The problem is become very difficult to manage the urban and semi and movement away from rural areas. So that is something that needs to be really addressed. And the problem generally in the developing world, I speak with the context of India in the background, is we tend to pay a lot of attention to the push factor, but there is very little attempt to save people from moving to these areas in terms of reducing the push factors, right? So you have an excessive of pull and a very little I would say, management of these factors in the rural areas. So, for example, I would address two specific areas of education and healthcare. So when it comes to education, especially when you come from a developing country background, there is no one level of education. So your rural level education is going to be much more basic. These are people, first generation schoolgoers, compared to, let's say, what we classify as tier 1 and tier 2 education system, which are more urbanized. They have a better level of access. So the tendency is for people in the people who have a better access to education, or they are trying to move away from the economic hardships, to access these high levels of education, which would then move them away from the agricultural pattern and the usual tropes they would go for, like an IT sector or a medical sector, engineers. And these sources are mostly available in the urban settings rather vis-a-vis the rural sector. For example, I would like to take my example. I come from a very small place in remote Himalayas, as I like to say. And given my background in international law, there is no way that I am going to find the kind of employment with my sort of formation. So I have no option but to move to a bigger city like New Delhi to find opportunities, and especially towards growth opportunities, right? So all the public sector undertakings, the multinational corporations, the, let's say, bigger law firms are always situated in these urban settings. So there's a huge pull factor for people seeking better opportunities. And that's the reason why I bring it up. It's very cross-sectional. Normally, the tendency is when you look at an urban-rural migration pattern, you tend to look at the economically less well-off people. Yes, there is a tendency, they tend to be a bulk of the population, but there is an existing, especially in the Indian background, of professionals in different sectors, really crowding or centering upon these metropolitan areas, let's say for the New Delhi, Bangalore, which tends to be the hub of the IT sector, or the financial sector in Mumbai. So that again informs the healthcare access. Why I say that is, yes, it gives you a better access to services, but now when you are in a public health crisis, having a huge population is not to your advantage. And that's where the lower economic sections become really pertinent. They actually move towards bigger cities, towards having these critical health measures, better access to medicines, even the chance of having better diagnostics. But they tend to be disadvantaged when it comes to the current situation, the pandemic situation, because to access basic healthcare, now they are being asked for papers, which they cannot provide. And now they're being forced to move back into wherever they come from, creating a huge health situation, because not only they are not going to get that healthcare access, which actually drove them from their sources to come to a bigger city, they're also going to be carriers. They're going to increase human transmission and make the situation worse in cases where there is absolutely next to zero possibility of providing healthcare solutions. And that, again, goes on to inform your security and human rights perspective, right? So it's extremely intertwined because for example, the migrants, let's go to the economic less well-off sections, they access to less basic housing in a bigger city is always a problem. Then you see urban sprawl, you see mushrooming of slum areas, which have very little access to healthcare, sanitation, or even fresh water, which is in a way a violation of their basic human rights, which they should ideally have. And that is a huge problem. Usually the tendency is to focus on providing them better possibilities, but very little thought is given to the fact that maybe if there was a way of shifting these opportunities to rural areas to reduce these pull factors, that would be a better management of issues. Having said that, there's another security issue. You would see in these settings where you have very crowded spaces with very non-educated to semi-educated populations who are often just filling in the labor sector or the manual service sector, there is an increased incidence of sex and gender-based violence. And that again not only leads to a huge human rights issue, it's a basic security issue, not only vis-a-vis managing them in these spaces, as well as to the, let's say, a native population of a big city, which tends to be highly urbanized. And when these people who come from, let's very traditional structures, there is a tendency to have a cultural shock because gender roles, and I assume that the panelists after me are going to expound further on the gender aspects of migration. They do tend to have this huge cultural shock and this non-performance of roles that they are very used to growing up in. So that again leads to an incidence of violence, especially again, I re-emphasize to the nature of sex and gender-based violence. So largely we see that it's an intersectional, cross-cultural and across class situation. And that's what makes the challenge of urban-rural migration not only very complex, but very interesting. So I'll leave it at that and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sulekha, for really, bringing the pandemic in this situation as well. And I was just waiting that one of the panelists might bring up, and I think Vidhi also mentioned about the pandemic being one of these major drivers over here and kind of forcing this whole aspect of migration to another level. I like the fact that you linked the whole economic prospects as well with the aspect of education. And I think it's very, very important for us to really understand that economic prospects and education are very closely related to one another. And I liked how you kind of interlinked that. I think the point where you kind of left your argument out there and your point just over there, I think you left it somewhere around the aspect of human security. And my next panelist, Swasti, is, I think, just going to pick it up from there. She's going to go next. And I think, personally speaking, she's going to speak on a very sensitive aspect of the causes of migration. And perhaps it's something very, very close to my heart as well, and to many, many hearts out there as well. She's going to speak about gender discrimination as a driver of migration. Now, again, Swasti, we would definitely love to know and know your reflections out of it as to how exactly do you fit this whole thing in over here as a reason for women to migrate. I mean, what do you kind of understand, and how do you understand that one of the main reasons for women to migrate would be this? And maybe you can just throw some light on the women's perspective of this migration movement. And then maybe we can weigh down the positives and the negatives. And as we were discussing it before, I think it would be great if you can maybe shed some light on that as well.
Thank you, Shrishti, and thank you, Sulekha and Vidhi. Firstly, I think you've set the context so beautifully, and I just love the transition from Vidhi to Sulekha and then to me. I think one of the things that is going to help me for sure is the way Vidhi set out the framework, because as we all understand migration, the way we sort of bucket these factors and drivers in our heads, one thing that we can probably start doing as policymakers is being very conscious of whether these frameworks are going to be significantly different if we bring the gender lens in, because those drivers have a different index to them in terms of their push and pull factors and the way they affect rural urban migration. And I know although Vidhi and Sulekha have extensively touched upon the framework, I'm trying to going to make this a little bit more of a fun aspect and try and engage the audience here. So give me a second and I'll pull up my screen and we are going to have some fun together before we get into the serious aspect of bringing the gender lens into those frameworks. And apologies to all those people who are joining on Facebook, because it might be just very hard to get you on board in terms of the activity. But all those people on Zoom, looking forward to your active participation in this activity. And please feel free to jump in when you can, and we'll let you know what it really entails. So first of all, if all of you can probably just use the function on the top of your Zoom screen right now, you might be getting an option to annotate. If you're not, please let us know. If you are, would love to hear from you. Just drop in a text on the slide right at the screen in terms of how do you identify yourself as. And this could be your primary, it could be your secondary. The idea is not to understand who you individually identify as, but it's just to get a broader sense of the audience here. So
I think it would be best, Swasti, if you
Swasti?
can just let us know how it goes, because
just go to the
otherwise it
top
just...
of your screen where you might be seeing a green box in terms of where you can see that Swasti is presenting her screen, and go
Yeah.
to view options, click there, and you might be getting an option called annotate. If you're not,
No,
let me know.
Unfortunately, I am not getting
no,
that.
it's not there, Swasti.
Okay, if it's not there, that's fine. Use the chat button and drop in your answers there. That should also be fine. No worries.
No, unfortunately, the chat box is again going to be open for the audience towards the end. But I think we can kind of,
If
just
there is
think
anything-
about this.
If there's anything you want people to write down, you can open it for a while.
All right, sure. I think
While
that
your
sounds
session's
nice. Swasti, do you want? Maybe we can do that.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead. No worries. I'm
Alright,
cool
so-
with it. If you guys can manage and help me understand what are those answers that are
Of course,
pouring in.
as long as you're able to prove your point, and of course, I'm
Yeah.
really extremely looking forward to it, because as I said, that this is something really, really close to my heart as well. So the thing that you're talking about. So maybe if we can just have the chat box open for a while, and people can just post in their options out here. All right, I can see that it's working now. Yeah.
Yes. And I think this is working perfectly well.
Yeah. Continuing on.
Kriti, if you could just add on maybe that whether you identify as a migrant or not, because that's the topic that we have at hand. Just make sure you have like that answer as well captured somewhere here, so that we can, sort of get to the next point. And I see like a lot of people here are migrants, which is very
Yeah.
interesting. I also am a migrant myself. So, so Vidhi is not a migrant. Very rare to find these days,
Oh,
and wonderful to have that diversity in the group, because I think that will help us structure this argument going forward.
I'm a migrant.
Oh yes.
Thank you.
You're a migrant who's trying to
Permanent.
Come
migrate
back.
back, but is not getting the option. So, okay. So, point well proven. But thank you everyone for your responses. But if effectively, what I'm sensing is a lot of us here are migrants, and it's a good mix actually, and it'll be good to hear from both the perspectives. The next thing that I want you to go is, maybe if you have your phones on your side, if you could go to a website called www.menti.com. It's a very popular website. I'll drop it on the chat again. The link is on the chat window. Just go to, just maybe copy paste it on your desktop or your smartphones, anywhere if you have it. And I'll give you a PIN code to enter, and you can just head in and answer that question.
I agree. So Swasti was just too enthusiastic to bring this on board, and I felt that this should be over here to just add a little bit of fun element and maybe just get to know each other more, I guess.
Yes, and if the code is on the top of the screen, it's 7841175 Again, I'll drop it on the chat. Feel free to jump in and drop your answers. Thank you, Ishan, for doing that. So the question is essentially, why do you think people migrate? It could be a personal answer. If you've not migrated, what do you think why people migrate? That's also fine. Some of the options could be job, education, marriage, conflict, disaster, pandemic, other, never migrated. Even that's fine, whatever you think. And as you're submitting your responses, I can see them getting populated on the screen. And so far, education seems to be the hot choice of people.
Where are they migrating to?
Interesting. Very interesting. I see somebody's entered political environment, and I would love to speak to them personally on this call sometime if time permits, because these are very interesting reasons to migrate. And yeah, definitely something that we will find there in terms of an insight, I'm sure.
So
Okay,
Steve,
so
you can guess who put that political environment.
Swasti, was it you?
No, I'm not
I did.
participating.
Let's catch up. Let's catch up on that after this.
Absolutely. Interesting. Okay. So education and employment seem to be the hot choice here. Both of them being primarily somewhat economically driven, I would say broadly. Uh, and this tool does not give us the functionality, but if we could just probably do a mapping in terms of how did you identify yourself as, and then what was the primary factor for migrating, that becomes an interesting insight. The cross section, as Sulekha was mentioning, it could be very different from the way people identify themselves as, and that's precisely what we are hitting at. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for participating in this. We'll stop this here and come back to the presentation. And there are two case studies that I want to discuss today from the gender perspective. And again, it's not a boring case study. It's in the form of a video. So would love to have you watch that, and then we can just get on to a discussion based on what you see. So, okay. So these are two females. They have a very different story in terms of why they migrated. And I would love you to go through this, and then we will probably discuss what you saw. And just give me a second. I don't believe you must be able to hear the audio. Just give me a second, sorry.
Sure, take your time.
Because I think I'll have to share my audio as well for this.
Ha sido un largo camino.
Both these videos are not in English, but you will have to follow the subtitles because I think they make very interesting these studies.
Ahorita lo decimos fácil, Yocasta campeona mundial, pero no ha sido fácil, ha sido un largo camino.
Are you able to hear it?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yo sé que muchos ticos me tienen cariño, me quieren, porque he hecho las cosas bien, he ido al país a representarlos de la mejor manera. Soy Yocasta Valle, tengo 27 años. Soy campeona mundial de la Federación Internacional de Boxeo en las 105 libras. Bueno, mi papá y mi abuelito siempre han sido fanáticos al boxeo, les encanta. Pero allá, cuando me gustó, me enamoré del boxeo, fue cuando ya peleé, cuando ya recibí los primeros golpes y decir, aquí está Costa Rica presente. Yo fui a España y Japón y Alemania y tengo fans de ahí. La tica, qué linda, buena gente. Cada país que he ido me dicen, yo quiero que vuelva de nuevo. Esa parte discriminatoria, la xenofobia, aparte de mi nacionalidad, en el deporte. Entonces siempre ha sido doble y por mujer. No lo generalicen. Si alguien hace algo negativo, no es como, ay, sí, todos los nicaragüenses o todos los panameños son malos, solo por una persona. Para abrir los caminos y cambiar ese tipo de prejuicios, de decir, nosotras sí podemos, y cambiar, como dicen, ese chip de que la mujer puede ser campeona mundial. Porque yo las conozco a todas, son años de sacrificio para que nos empecemos a notar, para combatir la xenofobia entre todos. Todo empieza desde la escuela, se enseña desde los niños hasta el mayor. O sea, hay que ser empáticos con los demás. El mundo está lleno de inmigrantes, todos van hacia un lado, hacia el otro. Si dan cosas positivas, bienvenido sea.
Okay, so I hope you liked the video, but I would probably take a pause here to first understand from all of you, what was that one thing that hit you from this video the most? And you can again drop it on the chat.
To me, I would say empathy.
Yeah, and actually the panelists are free to speak, so please use your unmute option and probably jump in. That's perfectly fine.
I think perseverance that comes with migration.
Interesting.
It propels you to do better than others around because you constantly have to battle different stereotypes.
Interesting.
For a person who has never been migrant, I think it's just probably hit me where need to be more sensitive towards knowing, you generally don't care if somebody's a migrant or not, and sometimes pass on a comment. So probably that empathy, again, you can put it as empathy, as Parikshit said, but yeah, being sensitive towards this aspect.
Oh, by the way, this is actually not in sports, but there were a few people who were very hostile to me, initially. And the best way to, I think, probably circumvent this is kindness, actually. They come back to you and talk to you once you're so kind. It has happened to me, actually. I think this person was from Brazil. Little hostile initially, but eventually, as I mentioned, yeah, kindness, empathy will actually turn them around.
Yeah, double discrimination is something that really stands out because it's not just the fact that you're a migrant, you're being discriminated against, but also because you're a woman. So that intersectionality sort of stood out.
Thank you, KP, for sharing that. And that's actually one of the things that hit me as well, not to say that the others are not important. And also, Parikshit, thank you for sharing that story, because I know those are sensitive things and people generally don't want to talk about that. But for me as well, I think the big thing that hit me about this video was we often forget that there is a layer to the kind of discrimination that we see in cities, especially when there is a gender lens involved, that, people who are already in general discriminated, migration adds a layer on top of that. And then it becomes a very different kind of a framework that we need to use in order to solve for those conflicts or those kinds of sensitive policy questions that intersection sort of raises, in terms of, again, taking cue from Vidhi's framework, the index which you may use to measure those factors will change when there is a gender lens added to that. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail, but let's get to the second case study, which is a bit more different from the first one. Let me play that and then we'll get into a quick discussion. Again, a short case study.
Nos han hablado de las trochas, nos hablaron de dos trochas. Una, que por una montaña que hay una cueva, no sé. Y la otra es por los taxis. Que un taxi, no sé por dónde se mete, que sale y sale directo a Quito. Pero de verdad no sé qué tan real sea, no sé si es seguro, no sé. Primero nos han dicho que uno paga el dinero y dejan a uno mitad camino de la montaña. No, yo no me voy a ir por una trocha. Yo no me voy a ir por una trocha porque yo llevo mis niños y no me arriesgo a llevarlos a meterlos por una trocha. Es un negocio, es un negocio.
Okay, so let's get back to the discussion. And the two case studies are, I think, if you think about it from your gut, it'll make you think that they're significantly different in the way and the reasons why they might be migrating. Both the females are essentially migrants, and they have, one of them is crossing borders, and the other one is moving within the borders. But they have a very similar story in terms of some of the challenges that they face, which is the double discrimination. And researchers, when they look at migration from a gender lens, have broadly classified this theory into two separate compartments. One of them is, for example, what is called the autonomous migration. And autonomous migration is what you would have seen in the first case study, when there is an agency in females, or the vulnerable section of the society, and they sort of have the capability to decide for themselves, and they discover that agency that, migration is going to help me elevate the platform and economic opportunity for myself, and therefore it makes sense, and I'm okay changing my nationality, my citizenship around that, because it makes sense. And there are those barriers that you need to overcome for this. So that essentially comes from within, and which is why it's called autonomous migration. But then the second case study is something that is called associated migration, which is also one of the most prevalent reasons for women, especially in developing economies, and why they migrate, because most often they are doing it because of either an economic opportunity that their counterpart might have found in cities, or their sons and daughters might have found in the city, and most often they bring the entire family with them. So there is a pull factor that is operating at scale in the cities, and that's what precisely brings females or women to cities. But it is associated with a decision that somebody else might be making on their behalf, and that becomes and which is why these two case studies, although they have so much similarity in terms of the kind of double discrimination that they might face in those cities, and there is a safety angle especially involved when it comes to looking at women, they have very different reasons to migrate, and the driver is very different for both of them. And which is why when we look at the framework, for example, that Vidhi mentioned, it's going to be significantly different for women. And this is one of the most heated debates and arguments in migration studies as well, that we need more gender disaggregated data to gather those insights as to why women migrate, because that answer is going to be significantly different for women. And just to throw in some stats here, it's not like women migrate more than men. Internationally, if you look at the international stock of migration, 48.1% of women are migrants. So it's not that they're not migrating enough, but their reasons might be very different from the way the other section of the society might be migrating. And if we need customized policy solutions, we need to also think about that cross-sectionality, the intersectionality of issues that adds a layer on top of whatever other reasons might exist why people migrate, to understand and explore those questions at depth. And the second panel of GPODS is going to look at that in depth. So I'll probably pause there, but I just wanted to bring this little nuance in terms of your thinking, that when you think about why women migrate is going to be considerably different from why other sections of the society might be migrating. And it's always good to keep that thing in mind, So I'll turn it back to you, Srishti, because I know I've taken a lot of time and we have like a whole bunch of people waiting to speak, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the
But it's been so worth it, Swasti. Thank you so much for this mind-blowing thing. I mean, I think you just left it on such an emotional aspect as well. And I'm sure that this is that tiny portion, yet it's going to bring such a big impact in each one of us, thinking. And I think this is one of the biggest takeaway from this session that we will be taking. Thank you so much for that, Swasti.
Thank you. And I hope you had fun.
Of course.
Awesome.
Of course. Thank you so much for that. Thank you.
Very nice.
All right, moving on now. And I think that just felt like a fresh breath of air, and I think everything is just all fancy now and it's looking really nice. Okay, moving on to Anshika now, who's going to speak. She's going to speak on another very important topic as well, and perhaps a very quintessential portion of migration, which is the concern in regards to refugees. And I think particularly she's going to speak on climate refugees, because climate migration is, of course, a key issue and one of the most important reasons of migration. And I think it's very important that we bring that here on this table of discussion as well. I think she might also be, she's also going to maybe write and speak on the legal recognition and the protection of climate refugees as well. So over to you, Anshika.
Thanks, Srishti. And I would really like to, thank all the speakers who came before me, especially Vidhi, who focused on environmental factors, or today, where climate change is such an important issue as climate factors that lead to migration. So I would like to, focus on the fact that because of the enormity that climate change presents before us right now, and the impact that climate change is going to have virtually on every domain of our lives, whether it's employment, livelihood opportunities, or whether health, or even gender for that matter, because in most contexts, people, there would be some disparity in terms of, the trends that you see in migration, and that could have a gender, factor to it. And, you could see discrimination based on gender. So based on those factors, I think the climate change issue really in today's context is one of the, underlying factor that results into migration and can impact migration in all ways in terms of the trends that we're going to foresee in the coming future, or in the number of because 10 times migration today, or in terms of nature of the migration that we're also going to see, because most of the migration is going to be irreversible in nature, especially if the migrants are coming from, lands where they cannot return to. For example, if they're coming from like Maldives and all these small island nations, which are going to submerge in the coming years. Or, even if you want to put it in context, a good example would be, submergence of Sundarbans, which is a very key issue when people talk about migration, because a lot of the lands are submerging, they don't have place to go. So the irreversibility of the nature is also going to be a key problem, because if these numbers of people who go and, stay in other areas, you don't know how you're going to give access to all these people. This could lead to other factors that, lack of basic amenities. The implications that these are going to have in the areas where they're going to migrate is also going to be a very, huge area that we need to discuss and we need to really think about. I would like to focus on a very key issue when it comes to, climate migration, or rather climate refugees. Because in most of the context, if you see, people could migrate for reasons, personal reasons, or better employment opportunities, better, other factors like cultural factors, etc. But overall, in the recent past, and if you could see, majority of climate migration, environmental migration, is going to be more or less forced in nature as environmental degradation starts to happen, or environmental, climate factors like, climate impacts in terms of hazards like cyclones, floods. They're going to be a large chunk of the population which are going to be forced to migrate from one place to another place. That's why a very important issue that we want comes in climate migration is the factor that whether you classify them as a refugee or whether you still classify them as a migrant. Because refugee holds the connotation of the fact that they were forced to flee from a particular place, whereas migrant could be for any, doesn't hold that, kind of a, urgency to it as much as a refugee does, and how nations are bound to be. Secondly, if you see in terms, this is also one of the reasons why there has been so much of confusion in the international laws, why there's so much of confusion in terms of whether internal laws of countries, in terms of categorizing climate refugees or migrants and providing them with adequate kind of support. If you see the 1951 Refugee Convention, it has got no mention of climate refugees or environmental refugees. They talk about war, conflicts, etc. But these could also be, a result of climate factors. Like, though I would say that we shouldn't go so far, not every conflict is a result. We should be very wary of, attributing climate change to those facts. But somehow in recent past, you could see conflict also arising out of climate factors. So you need to be very, wary of that. But considering that there is lack of protection and the numbers that we're going to see and the trends that we're seeing due to, migration due to climate factors, I feel that, there should be more work towards, attributing, some sort of, protection and actually giving a recognition to these groups. Because unless the recognition comes, there could be no protection. Within India also, which is first of all, not even a signatory to the 1950 Refugee Convention, and it has no laws on internally displaced people. So we don't know, if you if you open any website right now on which works on climate migration or environment migration, and if you even generally see the migrating trends, the amount of people who migrate from rural to urban areas, majority could be categorized as, if you put them in the environmental or climate lens, they could be because, you know, some dam is coming up. So suppose, you know, there's so many development projects that keep on taking place, which, you know, in a like force people to flee because they don't have access to proper rehabilitation, etc. Or, you know, due to agriculture not being so productive anymore, and the kind of population that agriculture holds, around 60 to 70, almost 60-65% population, majority of people would want to migrate. But, you know, there is no adequate, you know, actually there's no available data. First of all, there's no recognition that these, you know, you categorize them as economic, etc., opportunities, cultural factors, etc., but you never put in the climate lens. It's only recently that you started putting the climate or the environmental lens. So if you don't put these, you know, if you first of all don't acknowledge them, there could be no protection. And I think the kind of data that has now been coming around, we really need to focus on environmental and climate migration, both at an internal, like nation context, and also international context, because we are going to see a large number of migration happening because of climate change in the coming years. There's no doubt about it. And how we're going to deal with it, it's like there's no, you know, like there's no consensus about it in anywhere, that how we're going to deal with that kind of migration, how we're going to deal with the communities that are going to come. We're going to be permanently displaced from one place to another place. So I think it's very important that we do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anshika, for that. And I think it's in the coming few years that we are actually going to see this impact of climate change, which is extremely triggering in respect to displacement as well, and in worsening the living conditions out there as well. There were some really interesting points that you made out there. Thank you so much for that. And I'm sure that once we move to the second panel, I'm sure someone is going to cover that up and bring up the challenges and solutions on that aspect. All right. The next person whom we are going to turn our eyes on would be Parikshit, and he's of course going to bring in and rope in a more analytical lens, an analytical side of this whole set of drivers. And perhaps with his extensive knowledge and expertise in bringing the whole data perspective here, I think it's going to be put to use to a great extent when he's going to put all that perspective in terms of migration, or as we like to call his ideas as unconventional ideas and reflections. So Parikshit, over to you now. And
No. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's just a scientific perspective. It might be a little dry, but I will just make sure that it's just a bare bones excursion into the analytical side of things. So I've gotten a fantastic fodder starting from Vidhi in terms of why do you migrate, the economic factors, and then segue it to the gender, you know, making sure that it's for male and it's for females, and it's totally different. Sudeka as well touched upon the health side of things. And Anshika ended up with saying that we don't have enough data. And now I think it's a very good starting point. So what I'm going to do is give you an insight into the evidence-based decision making. We're not going to get into the policy scenarios right in this panel, but it will set you up for a discussion around how do we make policy decisions, which is evidence-based. So let me just share my screen. It'll be very quick, so you don't have to get into the details of it, the mathematics of it. So just give me a second. So able to see my screen, right?
Yeah.
All right. So how do I get this screen out? All right. So yeah. So let's put on an analytical lens over here. So what does that mean? I'm going to give, as I told you, it's going to be a bare bones. So what does that mean to put on an analytical lens? So we're going to delve into relationships between data points, between metrics, apply some logic, have a coherent way of understanding, the whole fabric of migration. And then the concept of neighborhood, trying to find out patterns, which data points are close, similar to each other, and dependencies, between variables, who is the target variable, what are we trying to achieve in the first place? And the concept of belief, factoring your prior belief into your entire analysis. And then there is this linear and non-linear, and we'll get to this, although it's not very important to know, but let's go forward now. Okay, first let me try to get this screen out. All right. Yeah, so do you intend to move is the question. What are we trying to achieve? Are you going to move is the question now. That is the analysis all about. So let's say this is rural over here, this is urban, and the analysis basically went to these rural areas and wanted to check the migration intentions of the residents over there. And why do we do this? We'll get to know as we progress. And so when when the survey was done, it's a mixed method survey wherein it's a quantitative as well as a qualitative survey. So to check whether, hey, why would you want to move? So some of them said, hey, better education over there, better education in the urban cities, or there is a peer pressure, within the rural communities. It is very common for someone to migrate once they reach a particular age. They want to move and get education, make some good money, or maybe they might not have had a good family climate. That could be a very big driver. So a survey was done to closely question them and understand what was the motivation behind to move to these cities. And very, very important thing, which is I feel is neglected in India, is mental health, which is psychosocial care. People move to the cities, also cities beyond the boundaries, national boundaries. So moving to another country, developed countries have better mental health care facilities, and good cultural and sports centers. So, I moved to Melbourne, and if you ask me, I wouldn't go back to India, because one of the reasons would be sporting amenities. I'm just bombarded with sporting amenities over here. And over here, if you look at it, it's for children as well. My children would grow up, or anybody's children would grow up having great access to sporting facilities. And of course, finally, make money, tons and tons of money. So the survey was done to understand why would you move in the first place. So this is on the data collection side of things. So we are collecting data. And as Anshika mentioned, data is also an issue now. We are collecting data over here. We're going on the ground with the COVID in place. This is a big challenge that we'll have to tackle. So this might be a little arcane. So we'll just breeze through this. What are we trying to do is we are trying to feed in some of the factors that we discussed on the previous slide to get into the neural network model. So this is a neural network architecture over here, which is mimicking the brain, human brain. So all of the inputs is fed into a layer, and your output is what are we trying to predict, or what is the target variable? What are we trying to predict is migration. It's migration intention. Would you migrate or not migrate? Which would be one dichotomous variable. If you migrate, you say yes. If you know, if you don't, you say no. Okay. And we are trying to find a relationship between these independent variables on one end and the dependent variable on the other end. And once we find the relationship, and once we get to an equation of sorts, and then we can tweak each of these variables and see what would happen to the target variable. So essentially what we are doing is we're training a model. We're trying to learn from data, which we collected over here. And once the model is developed, and why do we get to a neural network architecture? Because if you've had some bit of training in mathematics, what we are trying to do is we are trying to model a non-linear relationship between variables. By non-linear, I mean curvilinear, which is not linear. A linear is something, an increase in one variable leads to an increase in another variable, or an increase in one variable leads to decrease in another variable. So pretty linear. But you see a lot of curves over here, very complex relationships between variables. And that is when the whole idea of UAT comes into universal approximation theorem. Fine. So once we develop a model, get an equation, we have an equation in hand that will tell you if you feed in the values for each of these data points, you're going to get a target variable, and you'll know whether the person has an intention to migrate or not. And what can you do with that? Of course, if you know that the person is going to migrate, probably you can intervene with solutions, with policies, such that it will retain him in the rural area, or make sure that the city or the push aspect, which is from the city side, you push him to the rural side, saying that, hey, the city is so expensive to live, so expensive to rent an apartment or rent a house, so you better stay back in the rural place or the rural area. So you can design policies in such a way. So once we have the equation in place, now it's about doing a bit of a sensitivity testing over here to understand which of these variables that we collected here has an impact on migration intention. So is it really family climate, or is it really mental health issues, or which variable has a greater impact on the target variable? And if we can know that, which is very difficult, but there are a lot of hidden variables as well over here. Some might say, yeah, maybe a better climate over there, but in actual, it would be, better education for the children, or, he would want a better quality of life, or there is a peer pressure, just pushing him to the urban side of things. So we try to boil down to variables which have a heavy impact on the target variable, and that will give us, a fantastic springboard to design policy solutions, because it's evidence-based. You have data in hand, you've applied, you've done all the, learning from data, and to intervene with solutions, what you do is you get to something called a scenario analysis. And what does a scenario analysis do? So you will have to, we will come to this probably towards, the end of the next panel, just a brief excursion into this, which, after some of the panelists will cover topics around climate change and stuff, then we can come back to this. But so far, I think this is the skeleton, that we have set up, where we have data, we have a model, we have learned from data, and now we have an equation. So if you plug in variables, you're going to get an output, and the migration intention of the residents in the rural area beforehand. So there is a compelling urge to know what the target would be beforehand. So before even they start to migrate. So yeah, so that's about it from my end. Feel free to hit me up if you have anything that you want to discuss, but this would be the tone for the next panel, wherein they'll start talking about the future. What can we do about it? Can we buy some time so that we can set up, prepare our cities well, so that handle the exodus from the rural area? So yes, so that's about it from my end. If it sounded a little arcane, so don't worry about the neural networks or any technical details of it. So it's you just have to get the sense that we have trained something, we have evidence, and now we are looking into the future. Yep.
Thank you so much, Parikshit, for that. I think there were very intriguing points that you made, certain here and there. And I'm sure that the audience is, they are going to make full use of the chat box, and they would love to know some or the other points from you at some point of time. I like the fact how you kind of ended the first panel on such a note that you'll now be linking, and we'll now be linking all these points to the next panel, where we'll be coming about, and we'll be coming about with different policy solutions, the challenges, and the whole aspect of anticipation overall. So
beautiful.
It's, yes, thank you. So it's about 7:48 according to my watch, and I know that this 3-hour session would be too long to go about with it. So why don't we just take a break for another 10 minutes, perhaps? 7:48 by my watch. So let's be back here at around 7:58, perhaps. And then we can continue with the second panel. And I can assure you that the second panel is going to be a more interesting one, because it's all about policy solutions. And come on, I mean, we're a GPODS, so this is what we are meant for. This is what we are being, carved for in the next future. So I think the next session is something that we'll be looking forward to extremely. So let's just take a quick break, get some water, get some coffee, eat something, and see you all at around 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock by my watch. Okay, thank you.
Scan.
And another very important issue is climate change and how that impacts people in rural areas, sometimes disproportionately in comparison to people in urban areas. And Sulekha also mentioned this, that migration has been a phenomenon for several centuries now, but the reason that it's become so important right now is because of just the sheer scale of migration. So right now, according to the UN, around 50% or so of the world's population lives in urban areas, but this is expected to grow to 70% in 2050, and we're not equipped to handle that kind of a population load in cities or in any urban centers across the world. And so I'd also like to, now as Shrishti mentioned, I was going to talk about how migration also, so with the issue of migration is the issue of modern slavery. It's very deeply entrenched in this entire issue of rural to urban migration. A small disclaimer before I begin. When I talk of migrants, I'm largely speaking of people from economically disadvantaged, from the economically disadvantaged or weaker sections of society, because more often than not, they're always at the receiving end of a lot of unfairness and a lot of issues that people with the better economic status don't face. So when it comes to modern slavery, it's defined, it's an umbrella term that covers forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and other slavery practices. Now, with any issue that you take, any social issue, women and children are always disproportionately impacted in comparison to men. And this holds true even for migration. So there's this organization called the IOM, which is the International Organization for Migration. So it's affiliated with the United Nations. And they came out with this very interesting report in 2019, which just tells you of the sheer disparity when it comes to women migrants and men who are migrants, and how the situation they face are very different. So when it comes to male migrants, while they're also victims of modern slavery, they're largely at the risk of being used as forced labor in construction and manufacturing. On the other hand, when you consider women as migrants, they're normally, they have the issues of forced labor, forced marriage, and when it comes to forced labor as well, it's in the domestic sector. So, which means that they work in homes, so they're isolated from the outside world. They can't ask for help. If you have male migrants working in a factory, several of whom are being treated unfairly, at least they have that social network. Either way, it's not correct. But the issue that comes up with women is that they're isolated and they don't have the social networks to reach out for support. And there's another report from the ILO called the Global Estimates of Modern Slavery. So this focuses only on two aspects, forced marriage and forced labor. And according to that, 71% of modern slavery victims are women and girls. So this begs the question of what can be done then, because it all seems like there isn't much that can be done, because this is a truth that has been occurring for a long time now. But there's this company called Shahi Exports in India, which structured these support groups for migrant women. Now, this is again on a very small scale because this was limited to this organization. But what they did in their organization is to create this buddy system wherein migrants coming from a certain state in the country who are new to the company will be tied in with a migrant who's come before from the same state, just to give them a better social experience. And now if this could be scaled up to larger areas, say cities or any urban space, then women would actually know that what they're going through is not acceptable and that there are legal measures that they can seek for help. So one thing that most countries have is legal measures in place to avoid bonded labor and to avoid any sort of exploitation. But more often than not, none of these laws are enforced. If these were enforced, this wouldn't be an issue we'd be talking about. But unfortunately, they are not. I believe someone in the previous panel mentioned this as well. I think Swasti talked about how we need gender disaggregated data, because the issue right now is that when you look at stats for migration, you get migration with regards to men and women as a whole. You don't get individualized data, and you don't know what women are actually facing. There are very few reports that actually specify how women are more at risk than men when it comes to human trafficking. So I mentioned that women are more at risk when it comes to sexual exploitation. This is basically a non-issue for men. This is not beliefs that I hold, but these are beliefs that were that the IOM report, that the IMO report reiterates as well. And also
when we were talking about this, KP mentioned, Krishnapriya mentioned how we could have civil society organizations contribute more to the entire process, because policy interventions are not a solution entirely, because just by the level of migration that is happening, it's not possible. So civil society organizations need to be given more powers when it comes to helping people who are disadvantaged, whether male migrants or female migrants, and to help them reach better circumstances. Another thing that also happens is that while several governments globally have rehabilitation programs, so they will rescue people who are in, say, in bonded labor situations or in any other situation that is not legally acceptable. But they are, and so they're rescued, but they aren't given the means to avoid such a situation in the future. What really should be done is to empower these people either through education or through financial means, so that they won't be vulnerable again. Otherwise, it's not a real solution. You rescue them for the time being. Who's to say that it won't happen to them again? And another thing that also struck me while I was doing reading for the panel and in general was the fact that a lot of these migrants, when I say migrants, I mean people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, they work in the informal sector, so they don't have the legal protections that we do, that people in the formal sector do. While there are laws that supposedly protect people in the informal sector as well, they aren't stringent, they aren't enforced, and people in the informal sector lack the education to guarantee the enforcement of these laws. Now, if any multinational corporation were to discriminate against any section of society, people would have the means, people working for the company would have the means to raise their voice, start a social media campaign, do something about it. This is not the case for people in the informal sector. For them, it's survive. It's basically about survival. In such cases, you can't expect them to stand up against their employers and ask for rights and ask for their rights to be enforced. So while, again, I speak for India, but I'm sure this is the case globally, while there are labor inspections and this is entrenched in the law as well, it's not enforced sufficiently. And that needs to change as well. If at least we are more stringent in our labor inspections, if we're more stringent in the enforcement of the laws that exist, things might improve a bit. Also, yeah, and I guess I'd be open to questions that anyone had, but I'm thankful to Swasti and Sulekha for setting the groundwork for what I want to say.
Of course, and I was secretly wishing maybe Swasti would like to make a supporting point here and there, and I don't see, maybe Sulekha isn't here because she had to hop on to another meeting. But Swasti, if in case you maybe have another supporting point that you wish to add to Asma's, because I really understand, and I like the fact how we were just talking about the economic aspects and the economic causes that, I mean, we started off with the economic causes, of course, and then we turned the tables to the social causes. And I think somewhere I'm getting that this whole migration is just so important for women and girls. It's more of a feminist issue, because it concerns women and girls. And I like the points that Asma made over here. I was just hoping that maybe Swasti would like to make a couple of supporting points since you already started off with this topic in the first panel.
Sure, I can probably add on to Asma's point, as she's put forth some great points, and just to enrich this further, one of the things that I often think about, and I would leave it for the audience here also to think about, is we sort of quantify the level of economic activity of migrants, and that is a key argument if you look at either dispelling some of these myths around migrants, whether the influx of migrants actually generates more economic opportunity for the source of or the point of origin or the point of destination, and it most often is used as an economic argument to either define your positioning in terms of being for the topic or against the topic. But one thing that when it comes to gender is very critical in terms of understanding is there are huge chunks of our society and our economy that are run by women but are not accounted for. Like for example, what about prostitution? And it's a market that is heavily dominated by female migrants, and there are a lot of countries around the world that don't even account for that as a part of their economic activity. And then will we need policies to sort of address that issue from a gender lens. And it's a different question to make an economic activity illegal, but a very different question not to measure it at all. So it becomes then a very important question to keep in mind that maybe we are somewhere globally even underestimating the role of female migrants as a driver for economic activity. And if we account for that, we don't know, still don't have an answer. Are actually female migrants adding more value to the overall economy of the globe overall? We don't know, because there are so many sectors. There's so many sectors like construction where women are still debarred from entering. There are legal barriers literally in a lot of manufacturing sectors. Women can't run late night shifts. So when they migrate to city, there is a dream. And I will go back to some of the frameworks that I use, like autonomous migration of women. We build a dream, and migration is effectively a hope, that we instill. What happens to that hope if you come to the city and you find that you cannot even be employed in those sectors which you probably thought of, just like your male counterparts? So those, and you probably land up in sections of the society where you never wanted to be. So I think those are questions that require a gender lens, and we probably, the starting point for me would be start measuring it. Even if we can continue to debate on whether to make it legal or illegal, and I understand there are hundreds of arguments for and against it, but let's at least start measuring, because only then can we start solving for it. I'll probably rest my case because I think Asma covered everything else very beautifully.
Hey, I just have something that I just want to float around. Definitely. It was around, you spoke about male and female with regards to the gender aspect. So what about LGBTQ migrants? Do we have any data on them? What's the,
Data is sparse, Parikshit. It's not very available. Even with so when Swasti raised the issue of having sex disaggregated data, it's very important because we don't even have that, and that's not available, unfortunately. It's very limited.
I've looked at the data for India, so I can speak for India, but maybe not for other countries. So India started measuring labor data across 3 compartments: male, female, and they explicitly call it transgender. They don't have like a binary and non-binary definition in India. And at times that disaggregated data is not very clean. They sometimes club it under the male category and sometimes they club it under the female categories. So it's not very clean, honestly. And and there isn't enough available. So yeah, definitely a problem. Okay. Yeah.
But more than the data, but what is the climate around them? So are they migrating? What is the total scene around them, the status quo? Any ideas?
I wouldn't be able to contribute to that because of the absence of data. I have absolutely,
I don't think, I think at least in India, our starting point right now is where we are. We have just started capturing labor data on, LGBTQ plus, or even like anyone who's a non-binary. And even there, we don't have the crisp definitions of it, firstly. So till we don't have labor data, migration data is one level above that. So I think we are still at like phase 0 of it. Once we have that, only then will we get to the point where we can understand how are they migrating, what are the flows, how is labor moving, and things like that. So I don't think we are there yet, Parikshit. Okay. Yeah, just to answer that question very briefly.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Thank you so much for that. And I mean, of course, that always that's of course going to leave us thinking as to when will we, kind of open up the doors for such communities. And I think it's very important that we really need to bring about the inclusivity of these groups as well into, and of course, begin off with the data collection as well. So I think now the next speaker whom we have in the line is Krishna Priya, of course. And again, up until now, we were, of course, focusing on the social aspects of it. And thanks to all the panelists who kind of brought about different scenarios in it, different facts into this position. And now I think the tables are again going to turn in a slightly different way, where we're going to have the aspects of community participation and some information from KP on that. And I think I specifically need to know from her as to how engaging with migrant communities is a call for action. Because the whole idea of building partnership with the migrant community, we do know that vulnerable groups, including migrants, they have a very disproportionality, and in terms of the mortality rates and the morbidity rates as compared to the host population. And we often feel that it is imperative to engage with them to identify these needs and to include them in the delivery of such programs and services. So how exactly can we build those partnerships with the migrant community? That is the first aspect that we'll be getting to know from you, KP. And of course, I think you're going to open the doors for another wide section of environment and sustainable development goals. And I think the whole aspect of sustainability for the other panelists. So I think then we'll, take it up from there. So perhaps if you can just begin off with the whole aspect of community participation, then that would be great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Srishti. And I'd like to thank all the panelists for laying it out, so beautifully for everybody else, for all of us to understand. So just to, start off. So when I say city, right, when we think about a city, what are, some of the things that immediately come to mind? Like Swasti was mentioning, it's about hopes and, dreams, people coming in, Bombay is called Sapno Ka Shahar, the city of dreams. So people come in, hoping for something and hoping to achieve something and hoping for a better life, right? So then they come in, and then we see that a city is full of contradictions, right? On the one side, you have the economic class, which is very wealthy and very elite, and they have access to all the basic amenities, and then on the other side, you have communities that are, especially migrant communities that lack access to basic amenities like clean drinking water and sanitation, basic healthcare, right? So, and we see that cities have always been characterized by these inequalities, right? And when we talk about anticipating rural-urban migration in the 21st century, we know why people migrate, right? And we know why they migrate. So then we can expect more people coming into a limited geographical area, which is already constrained. And if the pandemic has shown us anything, it has shown us how ill-equipped our cities are to handle something like this, and how disproportionately certain communities get affected by instances such as a pandemic, right? And on a similar vein, we can also see that climate change also disproportionately impacts certain vulnerable communities. So for example, if we take the city of Jakarta, so Jakarta is obviously of course the capital of Indonesia, and I don't know if you guys know, but Jakarta is actually sinking. So it is sinking not just because of rising sea levels, but it's also sinking because of poor urban planning. And the people that are immediately impacted and most vulnerable to this are people that live on the fringes of the city, that live closer to the sea, right? And they lose their livelihoods, and they lose their families, and they lose they have no access to food, they have no access to safe housing. So we, as the cities exist right now, they're already full of contradictions and full of economic inequalities, which is why it is absolutely important and it's imperative that when we think about making a city inclusive and making a city accessible and making urban spaces accessible to people, we have to think about the people that are most vulnerable to changes. So even in Bombay, right? Bombay floods every year, right? But the communities that are impacted the most are the communities living in the low-lying areas. And these communities are more often than not economically disadvantaged, and some of them don't have permanent housing. And so these are something that I just wanted to draw attention to, because cities as they exist right now, I'm just going to reiterate this because I really want to emphasize on this, and they are not inclusive, and access to resources and access to education, access to health is quite exclusionary, right? And especially in the developing countries, the gap is quite high. So when we talk about bridging that gap, right, which brings me to the sustainable development goals. So the sustainable development goals obviously are full of hope and optimism, and they give us something to strive for, right? We have to strive towards something, especially as the next generation, we have to strive towards building better and doing better than we have done in the past. And now we see all these challenges sort of mounting on top of one another, right? We have gender discrimination, we have discrimination based on sexual orientation, we have xenophobia, we have climate change, and we have all of these issues coming together and buttressing the existing inequalities that exist in today's cities. Then when we talk about sustainable development goals, then specifically with respect to urban areas, we have, SDG 11, which talks about making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable, right? There are 4 things here, which is inclusive, making them safe, making them resilient, and making them sustainable. Which then brings me to, so I actually had a video that I wanted to show you guys, but I don't know, it's quite a long video. It's about 9 minutes long, and it's basically how, Singapore deals with, the impact of climate change and, how Singapore manages its resources, because Singapore is a very tiny city, and how they manage their water and how they manage their electricity and how they, sort of address the issues that come about because of climate change. So I don't think we have the time for that, but I just want to say
perhaps
that,
just post it over here on the chat box. So
yeah, I'll just post the link here once I'm done.
Sure.
But so then let's come to, SDG 11. So when we talk about SDG 11, we talk about making the cities inclusive, right? So what is inclusive? Then we talk about basic things that everybody needs to get access to. And these basic things are, access to clean energy, access to transport, right? And access to infrastructure. So these 3 are, to me, the primary, basic tenets that we need to look at when we're talking about making a city inclusive. And there are many challenges with respect to each one of these things. But then, and those challenges, you can, trace them back to, again, some of the issues that Swasti and Asma had mentioned, gender and, economic disparities, etc. So then when we talk about bridging these gaps, right, the only way to do that is to go to community, to the target community, and ask them and, take in their inputs and see how we can make their lives better, right? And that really starts with community engagement and participative decision making. So there has been an interesting case study in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital of Mongolia, where clean cooking, access to electric stores was provided to, vulnerable communities that were living within the city. And we have these, limited sort of initiatives that are happening all over the world. So for example, in Mexico City, is, located, near the equator and gets a lot of rain, but there is no equitable distribution of clean drinking water in Mexico, right? So then there was this company called Agua Urbana, I think, or Isla Urbana, I forget the name, my apologies. But what they do is they go to these communities that do not get water, and they help them, they help them with rainwater harvesting, and they help them, become self-sufficient. And so these are some of the initiatives that are happening, in pockets. And there is also an NGO called Grid Alternatives, which is based out of California. And what they do is they train low-income communities and migrant communities in installation of rooftop solar panels. So it's basically you're hitting 2 birds with 1 stone. You're creating employment for migrant communities, and you're making your energy. You're making your city greener, and you're making it cleaner, right? So these are these tiny initiatives, which again brings me to something that we need to be very cognizant about now, that the importance of local governments and the importance of urban local bodies in driving these changes, in making our cities safer, in making our cities inclusive. And a very interesting segue now is to urban diplomacy. So there is a group of cities called C40, which is these 40 cities that exchange knowledge and exchange resources, and and striving towards achieving your SDG 11. So on that note, and coming back again to Indian cities, right? We know that they're full of contradictions. And for example, I think Anshika had mentioned Kolkata and Sundarbans earlier, right? So for example, if you take Kolkata, so Kolkata is exposed to extreme weather and rising sea levels and refugee migration from both, the rural West Bengal and also from the state of, from Bangladesh. So we see our cities are, not in very great shape now. And the only way to make sure that we create resilient cities and we create sustainable cities of the future is through, community engagement, is through participative decision making. And it's, just creating, keeping the people in mind at the end of the day, because to me, a city is not about, the buildings or the infrastructure, it's not about the buildings, it's about the people that live there. Right, and it's the people that make city what it is. So on that note, I would like Srishti to ask any questions and pass on the mic to the next person.
No, thank you so much, and I do like the fact that you touched upon the SDG 11, because I was of course wondering throughout, as in when you told me that you wish to speak on that, as to what SDG 11 is all about and how are we going to link it. But I think you've linked that beautifully. And of course, I do know that community participation and the ideas surrounding it are something that you're extremely passionate about. And you have just somewhere, pushed the need and the urgency for that in regards to that. I like the fact how you basically placed on record about the entrenching inequalities and the aspect of inclusiveness as well. So thank you so much, KP, for that. And here's the video. But you might want to add that to the group on the chat box so that they can access it. Thank you. All right, moving on now. We are just coming now to the end of this whole panel, but we still have 3 more panelists who are, of course, going to open up the discussion in regards to environmental sustainability and environmental solutions, because the next person whom we do have over here is Marie. And Marie, of course, is going to speak particularly on regards to environmental solutions, and she's going to focus on the aspects of biodiversity. Now, since we are the GPODS fellow, and of course, you should be understanding that a major portion of our studies and interest and understanding revolves around environmental challenges and sustainability. So at bringing that on board, I think I would request Marie to please open up this portion of the panel discussion in regards to the environmental solutions. And I'm sure that she's specifically going to focus on biodiversity, since she was very keen on bringing that on the table, and perhaps even connect that with the concern of smart cities, because I think it would be really great if you could just briefly explain to us what the smart cities are and what is the theory behind it, and maybe then open up the larger subtopic discussion in regards to globalization and connections. Of course, you're going to begin off with the biodiversity thing, and then maybe we can take the floor there, right? Over to you, Marie. You need to unmute yourself, please.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you now. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
All right.
So I will be focusing more on the biodiversity aspect and social aspect of migration. And thank you for all the previous panelists for laying the ground and focusing more on human rights and all the other aspects. It's been very interesting. And as you all know, biodiversity is really the basis for all human life and therefore cities as well. And biodiversity loss, just briefly, is caused by pollution, destruction of habitats. So for example, soil pollution and deforestation, overexploitation of natural resources, alien species, and climate change. And if you look at from the city's perspective, if you take the whole land surface area of the Earth, cities cover only 2% of the land surface, but they are actually responsible of 75% of the natural world resource consumption and pollution discharge. So they are a very big cause for, they have very big ecological footprints. And as already been mentioned, the urbanization is only going to increase in the upcoming years. So the stress to biodiversity, but also to climate change is also going to increase. There isn't actually much research done that what urbanization and migration and biodiversity more specifically means, not so much in the context of developing countries. There is a little bit more information from developed countries. But for example, to illustrate it, there is a synthesis center of German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research, who has reviewed around 900 studies that are related to urbanization and biodiversity. And what they found was that direct effects of cities on natural habitat and biodiversity occur when urban areas expand or they are converted into natural habitat into cities. And what they estimated that approximately the land area, a little bit over the size of UK, is being converted into city space between 2000 and 2030. And specifically, this is caused harm in coastal China, Brazil, and Nigeria, where there are very naturally rich biodiversity habitats. However, the indirect effects, which are resource use and pollution of urban growth and biodiversity, is going to be largely far greater than the direct effects. And the researcher estimated that just the area required to feed the world's cities is 36 times greater than the urban area of cities. And the food consumption or turning natural habitats into city area in terms of migration can cause challenges such as food security, issues related to land ownership, but also access to municipal services. And they are also more vulnerable to environmental risks. And now what could be done for this is the nature of cities suggests that policymakers can take up solutions such as, for example, create green networks with green belts, planting native species, arrest urban sprawl through city zoning and planning, promote low energy housing and efficient public transportation that everyone has access to, develop private green spaces, and leave ecosystems undisturbed. But as already being covered by Ashma and Krishna, we also need solutions to ensure that the social and economic equality actualizes throughout these green solutions as well. And for that, we need a behavior change as well. So we need carrots and sticks. So for example, we can use imposing penalties for consuming more land that is actually needed, or promoting bonus and offsetting schemes to compensate the negative impacts of biodiversity and ecosystems. But as already being mentioned, the urban changes and the solutions for that is not really just top down, but it's very much also a bottom up exercise. So the citizens need to be included, but also migrants to the planning process from the very start, not just at the end of the process. And it needs to be inclusive and it needs to be transparent. The prediction and the process needs to be planned for long-term, not just short-term aspects, but also we can educate and inform local authorities, such as policymakers or mayors, about best practices. But also these aspects, they need to be included in the budget, which means that they will actually get done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie. Thank you so much for that. And again, as I said, since you're just bringing the whole aspect of environment over here, I am sure that it's just going to give the green signal to the remaining two panelists to maybe pick up from here and then speak and delve into the larger questions of it. Thank you so much for that. Next, we have Neha, who's of course going to focus on the technological aspect of migration and basically mention to us as to how changes in technology has affected migration. And perhaps if I may just add a little question here as well, and I would love it if you can maybe address this in throughout your little reflections that you'll be making. I would particularly wish to know, and I'm sure that there would be people out there, they would be wondering to know that what would be the trend in the coming few years in regards to that. So maybe if you can just connect that dot as well to your reflections, then that would be great. Over to you, Neha.
Thank you, Swasti. Thank you, Shrishti. Sorry about that. Good evening to everyone from India. I thank all the panelists who came before me for laying the excellent groundwork. It has been, it's going to be really helpful to, for me to just put my points across without worrying that our participants would now not maybe have the background to understand them, but that's why, thank you very much. Like Asma said, more than 50% of the current population is already residing in the cities. And by 2050, this is expected to grow beyond 70%. Now, let us take a huge step back and go back into history and see why cities were built in the first place. We used to be foragers. We were always migrants. Humans have never, were never settled in one place if we go back, way back in time. But then since we are Homo sapiens, we eventually realized that we need not go around looking for food. We can grow the food in one place. And that is when the whole system of agriculture came in place. People were still migrating even after that, because though agriculture, as let's say a revolution back then was started, the soil would drain its nutrient content, and eventually they would have to go again to a new patch. And then as and when the innovation or the technology developed overall, we started settling down in one place. But still, everyone could have settled everywhere in villages and no need for city. Why did the need arise for cities in the first place? This was especially because a lot of technology developed in agriculture itself, because of which humans had surplus in food. And now they knew that this food could be, traded for other facilities. And that is how trade was born, which ultimately led rise to cities. Now technology, has always went hand in hand with this whole transition. Technology has facilitated the growth of cities from very early times. Now let me take a pause here and ask, I'll just share my screen. I also have a couple of Are you able to see my screen?
No, I think we lost that. So maybe you want to give it a try again. Can you maybe try connecting that again and sharing your screen again? Yeah.
Oh, okay. So if everyone could just go to, okay, my laptop is kind of hanging out.
Yeah, we can see it now. Neha, we can see it. Yeah.
If everyone could just go to the link that I have put in the chat, and let's answer this question. Is migration good or bad? We were never supposed to settle in one place, but then we settled and now we are migrating again. So what does the group over here think?
Oh, I would say good.
Why don't you use a Mentimeter there?
No, yeah, I've submitted my response. Yeah.
All right, okay. I think we should just give it a couple of seconds maybe for everyone to.
I really encourage the participants, because I hope this is fun, and it's been a long time since
We had the
really
Mentimeter working.
but yeah, I would really like if everyone gets engaged.
No, but I'm really happy that you guys put this Mentimeter thing into process. I think it's a very fun way to engage everything and just get to know the audience as well to a greater extent.
Okay, wow, great. So
I guess, Neha, there's a bias here considering we are a lot of migrants in this group. We obviously
no,
think
I
it's
know.
good.
That is why I want to put a point here. So it's neither good, it's neither bad, because of migration, a lot of good things have happened. There has been tremendous growth, industrialization happened, wars also happened. A lot of things happened because of migration, good and bad. If we could like all the panelists before me have laid down this point pretty well, if we could just eliminate this whole inequality and discrimination in any kind, and good access to basic human rights and everything, it's a good thing. But it's as of now bad because we are in this process where one day we hope to arrive at a situation where no one is uh, everyone is provided with everything that they need for leading a good life. Okay, let me go to the next question. It will automatically appear on your screen. Let me just see how much has everyone gathered so far. So what do you think are the most important factors that help these cities run or facilitate the overall imagine the best of best city which has all the facilities and no one is suffering? What do you think? Okay, great. Infrastructure. Mm-hmm. You can put in a number of answers because there's not one factor that helps. So feel free to add on. Transport, online deliveries. Wow. Public spaces, services, green urban spaces. Okay. Cultural life. Water, yeah, good one there. Hospitals, yes. Yeah, certainly need wine. Okay, so these are great answers, and this is a very smart group here, mostly covered everything. I'll just keep this screen running, and let me still, put out all the factors that the United Nations and all the experts out there in the world think are very important, which have helped cities flourish, proven by history. So there's mobility, we have that. There's healthcare, there's security, there is water, there is energy. Did anyone put waste? Yeah, no one bothered about waste, and that's very sad situation even today. Start bothering about waste, people. Then there is engagement in community. We have that on the board. There is economic development, housing, all of the employment will come under that. Then there is governance, and these days I would also like to add air. We need. Okay, so these are basically the resources which help us city function well. We could consider them as factors. Now, why did I ask this question in the first place is to come to what I have been asked to talk about, technology. Everything on this board can be solved through technology. A lot of data gathering needs to happen across all of this to assess the policies, but technology can help solve all of this. Let me just quickly put out there there has been a massive growth and innovation in terms of manufacturing and consumption lately. We are almost on the brink of, there is hardly any resources left for us to get drinking water. We are almost out of it, and there is technology growth to actually desalinate water and get a fresh water out of it or create water from waste. Then we have cloud technology, which almost can help in all of these sectors. Then there's been a lot of air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. All of these can be measured, and restriction governance, all the policies could come in, play their role to understand better. Then there are monitoring technologies which could eventually help build smarter cities. And what else? Uh, the energy sector is also growing enormously. So basically, my point being that technology is developing and it can actually help with all these points that we have on the board. But then where are we lacking? Why are we not able to solve all these problems? It's because the major challenges around here, we first need to go back and provide people with the education to actually understand how to put this technology to use, because one person who knows the technology sitting in New York cannot solve the problem for say Mumbai. So we need to educate these people to use the technology and solve the problem for their community. When we say technology, it's not as easy to just bring it in and put it to work. There is a big aspect about privacy, access, adaptation to this new technology. So these transitions have to be smooth while putting the technology to use, and that is where it goes hand in hand with how governments actually align their uh, priorities with and use these technologies to come up with the right context to use them in. Yeah, and then there is a huge gap of access between the technology for poor people, economically disadvantaged, etc. To fill this developmental divide, this gap needs to be filled in. So these are the challenges to help put this technology to use. So I would say anyone over here working in any sectors out there should try and help build an ecosystem which would help bring in the technology to help solve us all the problems that all the panelists earlier discussed extensively. And to answer Shristi's question, future of the cities, I think, is diverse, because um, migration is going to grow, and there is no stopping it, because it's in the basic rights. Anyone can be anywhere. They're free to uh, do as they will within the rules, of course. So migration is here to stay, and future of the cities is diverse. With the technological aspect, I would say cities are going to be more self-sufficient now onwards, and with the whole climate angle, the cities are also the government and all the leaders everywhere would have to be very creative in deploying be it policy solutions or technological solutions to ensure that we are not harming the environment, retaining as much of as resources as possible. Then again, one major change I think would happen is nowadays cities are mostly built around a particular industry. Uh, this is going to probably go away in the future, and yeah, that's about it. I think we are going to be more connected again, uh, but cities are going to be smart cities very soon, and yeah, that's my answer.
Of course, I think that's going to be the scenario in the coming few years because, come on, I mean, we're living in this world of globalization and, you know, there's just so much of technological boom and globalization boom and from every aspect. So I do agree with that over there. And I like the fact that you brought the whole point of the digital gap over here as well. In reference to the technological gap and the digital gap and certain aspects revolving it as well. So thank you so much, Neha, for those reflections. All right, so we have the last panelist left now, and he's here just ready to present his thoughts and ideas. His name is Nipun, and he's been extremely keen on bringing on board the ideas surrounding climate change and migration, and how exactly it challenges the whole idea of migration. I am also guessing that, like Krishna Priya, he was very keen on floating the idea of community engagement. And so we're very eager to hear his points out in regards to that as well, and perhaps know his ideas. So over to you, Nipun.
Yeah, Shrishti, okay, right off the bat, I'd like to tender a big fat apology because I won't be able to sort of turn on my camera because there's been a power outage at my end. There's a small bulb running over my head, which makes me look like a gypsy fortune teller. So I'd much rather just use the audio here.
Of course.
Yeah, and also I'd like to extend a big thanks to KP and all the other foregoing panelists for actually laying up the groundwork for me to show and illustrate how community is absolutely paramount in not just offsetting the effects, the possible effects of the rural-urban migration, but even in general, how community can actually prove to be a sine qua non when it comes to combating climate change. And for my turn, I'll also go a bit off kilter with my approach here because I want you all to just do away with the basic theme of today's event, which is to look at it from only the migration perspective, only the rural-urban migration perspective. I would also recommend that you take into account even the situation of the climate refugees, i.e. the transnational movement. So not just movement internally within the bounds of the country, but even transnationally. So yeah, so with this, the basic reason why I'm actually asking you to do that, to take into account also climate refugees in tandem with the migrants of the rural to the rural urban migrants is that climate change affects everyone indiscriminately. So that goes without saying. So to actually keep them out of the pictures, the climate refugees would be a big blunder since they really take the toll too. And if you think about the archipelago countries, the low-lying countries, the low-lying island countries, it becomes all the more important for us to make a mention of even climate refugees on top of the rural-urban migrants. So yeah, there's no denying that the importance of community engagement in tackling the most complex issues is second to none. In fact, more often than not, it comes in handy where policy fails. Although I grant that with the support of policy, community participation can perform many times better. But wherever there's a complete lack of effect by means of policy, community engagement does really come in handy. And as it turns out, architects, I did some research and funny enough, it's actually architects who turned out to be useful in this regard. Architects can afford great help to offset the effects of climate mitigation. Excuse me, climate migration. No one thinks about buildings. Architecture provides opportunities for people to connect. Going forward, will need to not just, mitigate future, going forward, we need to not just mitigate future changes to our climate, but we need to work together to adapt and to plan for the changes to come. Interestingly, buildings are one of the keys to both mitigating and adapting to climate change. And connecting to other people in the community is the other key. There was actually research that I stumbled upon, which revealed that in the city of Toronto, buildings accounted for 52% of the total greenhouse gases emission of the city of Toronto. And globally, it accounts for 40%. Now, that makes them both the largest contributor and one of the potential key solutions to mitigating climate change. And it is, we are completely no strangers to the fact that the real estate market actually tries to sell us on the idea of living in palatial houses, furnished with glass doors, affording an expansive view, and whatnot. These houses, if made at a place where temperature varies by a margin of 60 degrees Celsius over the course of a year, glass boxes do very little to keep us comfortable without blasting the air conditioning or the heating mechanism full throttle. And no one talks about that. Buildings emit carbon in two ways. So there's the emission from materials used to build them, which is called embodied carbon. And then there's the emission from the fuels needed to operate the buildings, called the operational carbon. To reduce embodied carbon, we need to use material that are adaptable, durable, and have the lowest possible footprint. Concrete, surprisingly, is perhaps the most widely, not so surprisingly, it's the most widely used material, but surprisingly, it has one of the highest, it is one of the highest emitters of carbon. And wood, on the other hand, is the only structured material that actually sequesters carbon. That is to say, it separates the carbon from the environment and stores it. And yes, there's no two ways about it. Timber structures would allow us to draw carbon from the air, leading some to believe that it is perhaps wooden buildings that are the future of architecture. Although that is very much impeachable, and there's still a want of a great deal of research in that regard. But as things stand, it is a very concerted and a very strongly defended argument that wooden buildings might be the future of architecture. To reduce our operational carbon, I just told you how to reduce the embodied carbon. That is by going for different structure materials. That is replacing concrete possibly by wooden materials. Now, to reduce the operational carbon, we have to reduce our reliance on the fossil fuels. That's a no-brainer. That is to basically to essentially run the electric appliances, but that doesn't come as a surprise to us, because we know in order for us to cut back on our carbon emissions, in order for us to cut back on the operational emissions, we have to cut back on the on our consumption of fossil fuels. But it would be very much useful to also take into account that we can, in order for us to ventilate the houses, we need to tweak the design of the houses so that we can basically diminish our reliance on fossil fuels and such, so that we can use architecture in its rawest form and avail ourselves of the architectural expertise, rather than exploiting resources readily wherever and whenever we can. We should actually cash in on the olden architectural designs of, if you ever have the opportunity of visiting one of of a series of monuments which were built in the Mughal era, you will come to the realization that even back in the day when there was nothing, there were no electric appliances, they were very much able to keep the temperature in the interior of the courtyard or whatever to the bare minimum. And in doing so, they were able to do what most modern houses in today's day and age fail to do. So we should really cash in on the architectural expertise here. And studies have been done to predict what the weather outcomes will be for most of the cities based on climate change. We should be using all of that available data to model our cities and our buildings accordingly, so that they are resilient for the future. Now, thus modeling on historical data is no longer enough, because climate change has come into picture. And now we might, if we rely on the historical data to model our buildings, they might prove to be ineffective. They might stay hot in summers, they might stay too cold in winters. So we need to bring that architectural rigor into picture to actually do away with that whole scheme of banking on the historical ways of building structures. And at this time, action is more important than perfection. So we can actually, I think we can invest more in the design of the houses, the integral design of the houses, than how perfect they look. We shouldn't worry so much about furnishing the houses with glass window panels, with far-flung porches and stuff and patios and whatnot. We should focus more on how to make them environmentally viable. And so now you might recall how I said that remodeling the buildings was actually just one of the ways of adapting to climate change, which interestingly is also a way of mitigating climate change. The other way was through connecting with people in your community. I can illustrate this with a recorded incident. In 1995, Chicago was hit by a massive heat wave in which 739 people died in just a span of 5 days. And a socialist by the name of Eric Kleinenberg did an extensive research on this heat wave. He based this research on a concept called social infrastructure. This concept is about our shared spaces, so that these are things like community centers and libraries, but it's also the sidewalks and the grocery stores and etc. According to his research, what he determined was that socially and economically vulnerable people had a much higher mortality rate than those white economically advantaged ones. Now, this doesn't take us by surprise. This is fairly unsurprising. But where things got truly interesting was when he identified two neighborhoods side by side that had exactly the same statistical markers to say that death toll should have been high equally everywhere. But in one of those two neighborhoods actually ended up faring better than all the rest. And it had a lower mortality rate than even the most economically advantaged parts of the town. And the question was why? So what he figured out was that this community had an amazingly strong social structure. Its sidewalks and buildings were really well looked after. It had an actively engaged community group. Rather, it had groups, actively engaged community groups. And there were places for people to actually gather and such. So there was a depth to the connection that people had in that community. So when the heat wave hit, instead of staying in their overheated, unair-conditioned apartments, they gathered in the safe spaces and looked for who was missing, and then they knocked on their doors. And so it was this reaching out that allowed this community to cope, thrive, and adapt also during this time of change. Communities thus are composed of systems and people that are interdependent. And to build a resilient community, we must understand and deepen this very interconnection. We must, as rightly pointed out even by KP, we must go for and strive to build very inclusive communities, societies, and provide for overlaps, so that if one link breaks, it is barely felt by the whole. connected communities are resilient, which is what we need in this time of accelerated change. And on top of that, there's definitely more subtle architectural changes that can and should be brought about to mitigate and adapt to the changed climate setting, such as actually orienting the civic bodies which are entrusted with the duty of building roads and other public places to act. We need to educate them to evenly spread out the entirety of the city, to fragment the entirety of the city into equal bits, and then space them out such that there's enough space for the groundwater to permeate into the soil, to permeate into the ground, and thereby restore the groundwater level. And if that doesn't happen, that actually, I think that the case study that KP made a mention of, the one from Jakarta, that is exactly what's happening in Jakarta, because of the utter concretization of the entire metropolitan city. What's actually happened is that people, the majority of the homes in Jakarta are equipped with the underwater abstraction motors. So people keep on extracting more and more water, and because of the concretization, that extracted water is not replaced by rainwater, like rainwater. So it's not replenished by rainwater, and this actually causes the ground to sink in, compress, creating those areas of depression, and that actually gives rise to loss of habitat, loss of even livelihood if someone's actually conducting their business at that very place. And so there's a variety of other ways. We need technical know-how to actually offset the effects of climate change. And architecture really can play a big role. That's the basic upshot of my bit that I've presented. With this, I'd like Srishti to take over and take this event forward.
Thank you so much, Nipun, for those reflections. And I see that you took a bit of reference from Krishna Priya's aspect as well, and from Anshika's points that you made in regards to the climate migration. And I think at this point, I would just ask maybe Anshika and KP to please come up here and maybe just speak a few supporting points. And just for the audience, I'd like to inform them that the chat box has been opened for you all to post in your questions, your thoughts, and we would encourage you to make it as interactive as you can. Please post the questions that you specifically wish to ask for the panelists at this session, and we encourage you to do that. Perhaps even after KP and Anshika, maybe we can just ask Ishan to also come up here, and since he was the first person to post a question here on the chat box, and I can understand that he must have been so eager to speak a few words over here in respect to whatever Nipun said, and I'm sure that you must have echoed a few things from that aspect. So maybe Anshika first, then KP, and then we'll move on to Ishan. Yeah. Oh, Anshika, we can't hear you. Can you maybe just try unmuting yourself and then?
I've unmuted.
Oh yeah, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, it's really like an accepted fact that building community resilience and helping them adapt to the measures of climate change in whichever way is the way forward that can also help in reducing or impacting climate migration in a big way, especially the negative impacts that are going to be there, like the negative unforeseen trends that you're going to see in climate migration. But in the recent times, like if you see the climate data, whatever is being come out, I feel there's a very strong point being made that mitigation is now essentially, a thing of the past. As if you need to deal with the climate crisis, we have to talk about adaptation, and we need to see how communities can adapt. And adaptation is something that has to be done locally. It cannot be something that has a one size fits solution, because it depends on how communities, their socio-cultural, economic factors. So as the saying goes, like mitigate globally, but adapt locally. We need to give that factor to communities to come up with their own adaptation strategies, and and at a policy national level or international level, support these adaptation strategies in terms of, like, there's a lot of talk about, how developed nations should provide, finance and technology for helping developing nations to adapt or mitigate to the climate impacts. So that also should be considered, because there's a, there's an inequity in the space of climate debate, if you see, especially when it comes to, developing countries who are, the most vulnerable when it comes to the climate impacts. And in that also, the marginalized are obviously the most impacted by the climate impacts. So we need to really open the debate on how we should adapt, and how, at all the levels, be it international or national level, how we can support adaptation measures to climate change. Because even if we stop all emission right now, we're going to, reach 3 degrees by the end of the century, and it's not, it's actually, it would be a nightmare, because right now we are somewhere between 1.5 to 2, and Paris Agreement clearly states that 1.5 is the target, 2 is like the upper maximum target. We don't know what's going to be after 3, what impacts are we going to do. Even it's like countries are so ill prepared for the climate crisis, especially when it comes to adaptation. We all talk about mitigation, sequestration, etc. We don't know if something happens, how we're going to adapt to it. And rightly, as Neha also brought it up, like how technology can also play an important role in helping communities to adapt to climate crisis is also a way forward in how we can deal with climate crisis. But it just, just depends on a lot of negotiations and international collaboration and goodwill, because currently, if you see the climate space debate, there's a lot of, I see a, lack of collaboration, because there is, whatever the developed countries have promised, nothing has come about to developing countries. We're still struggling with basic needs. We're still struggling with a lot of things. We don't know if, 2030 is our target for most in 9 years. If we're dealing so badly with COVID, I don't know how badly we're going to deal with the climate crisis tomorrow. So I think the way forward will be really focusing on adaptation measures to deal with the climate crisis, especially migration being one of them.
Thank you so much, Anshika, for those reflections. KP, would you mind just jumping in and maybe speaking a few points in regards to that? And of course, what Nipun, spoke on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really like the fact that Nipun, sort of emphasized on the role of urban planning and architecture in, building cities of the future and making, making our cities more inclusive. Because I do think that every policy measure and everything that we do has to be, informed, and has to, sort of, it can't happen in a vacuum. I can't be like, okay, I'm an urban planner, I will only do this, and I don't care about, the consequences. I do think it's really important. And the example of Jakarta, the concretization and how that, sort of impacted the aquifer in Jakarta, and how that is causing the sinking of the city. And I think Neha had also mentioned, water scarcity, and these are all challenges, like I had mentioned, that are, that are here to stay. And we really need to, pull up our socks and address those challenges. And the only way to do it, personally, to me, is through, engaging communities, and through, ensuring that their problems are heard, and that, when we come out with a solution, that solution, solves those problems, that we hear the communities. So yeah, I really think that has to be. And like Anshika was also mentioning, mitigate globally, adapt locally. And I think that's something that just has to be our mantra for, when we think about cities of the future.
Thank you so much, KP, for that. I think we have a question specifically for Nipun here from Harsh, I think. And yeah. Nipun?
Yes, I did actually take a note of that. I am, as I speak, looking for the article which propounds that there's been considerable research into establishing that wood could actually be a very useful stand-in to concrete, and can be used to replace concrete as the building material. So let me quickly see if I can get hold of that article, and I'll get back to Harshit.
Maybe what we could also do is we could ask Harsh to write send us his email ID, and Nipun could also mail it to him.
Yeah, either way could work. I could do that too.
All right. Of course, we do have to move on to Ishan, of course, since he had posed the first question over here on the chat box, and I'm sure that he must be having some thoughts to share with us. Ishan, of course, is the co-director of the GPODS Fellowship, and I am sure if you'll be impressed by the way and the thoughts that he would be speaking on. So over to you, Ishan, now.
Thank you so much. Extremely engaging discussions, extremely relevant points raised. To Anshika's point that she just raised, I really like the fact that someone spoke of international goodwill when it comes to having these policy mechanisms in place, because most of the policy mechanisms, if you look at the history of international negotiations, they have been led by a particular country. And because of the recent events and the past events of how international relations have been with no particular country being at the fore, there is a deficit of international goodwill as to who do we side with. What if that country retracts again? What is the other country's diplomacy policy about something else? So there's a lack of international goodwill for everyone to come to the table and hide behind someone. And that is basically how arm twisting works in international negotiations. I personally love the fact that Nipun, being a law student, soon to be lawyer, talked about intelligent design, something that is absolutely out of his comfort zone. And I know that some of the other GPODS fellows have done that too. I know it requires a lot of study to be speaking at a panel that is recorded, that is going live, that is going to be watched by so many people, because it's going to be on our Facebook page, and the United Nations folks watch it and refer to their notes through this. So it requires a lot of confidence and a lot of study to speak at this session. And kudos to Nipun and those of you who's gone outside your comfort zone. I would not say that Neha has really gone out of her comfort zone, because now she's dealing with climate tech and climate innovation. So that's her comfort zone now. One thing, and again, I completely agree with Nipun and all of you who've spoken about community building, sustainable architecture, sustainable design. Biomimicry is something that we all should be looking at going forward. But it is that missing piece in all of our puzzles that we're still trying to figure out. And one thing that I have been becoming more and more sure of going forward is that circular economy. Circular economy in an isolated, integrated loop, as we discussed in the lecture, is something that we should probably be looking at, because it looks at zero waste. An ideal circular economy structure would have zero waste, which would mean that it would also, under the behavioral economics facet of circular economy, nudge people towards sustainable infrastructures, not just sustainability in terms of supply chain management, manufacturing demands and supply. And that's maybe something that should be given heed to going forward. I know that now we've had recently a European law that talks about such a thing, and hopefully we can now extrapolate it on an international level, even though, as we have learned over the past 3 months and over the last 1 year, for those of you who are joining us from the first cohort, and those of you who are planning to join us, you would know that there's a lot of consideration that goes into international policy making, sustainability. One of my lectures, the one that I was referring to, and if I may admit quite slyly, when Nipun was talking about how we do not talk about infrastructure and architecture. In one of my lectures, I discuss how the floor area ratio, which is a concept, I'm not getting into it, I don't want this to be lecture, but how floor area ratio reflects upon environmental impacts that are unapprehended. So it is the ripple effect of policies that seem majorly disconnected that bear the brunt on environment. And again, just to remind all of us, we all know, but just as a reminder, most of the countries around the world have perfect environmental laws. Yes, the implementation is poor. Yes, environmental equity and environmental justice are still issues, major challenges. And I think Anshika mentioned, and again, Swasti spoke about this, but our minority communities in terms of women, folk, children, other people, suffer the first and the worst always. And I'm not just talking about India, I'm talking about globally. So there is certain laxity in our attitude towards holistic understanding of this issue. And that's the other thing. That's the other challenge that comes with sustainability, because sustainability is also sustainability, but is also public policy, but is also diplomacy, but is also economics, but is also philosophy, but is also governance and politics and all of those things. And one has to try to be an expert in so many things to understand one simple cause of an environment impact assessment to why Japan is now planning to, release waters of the nuclear disaster, or why that hydroelectric dam that you've been to so often is actually awful for your community. And those answers will only come about when we do have a holistic understanding of all of these issues. So many of the sustainability issues, including urban infrastructure, including migration, including architectural design, and all of the complicated topics that you have been dealing with throughout, require all of you to study more, unfortunately, like it does to me. And I hope that the studies continue, and I hope the education continues, and I hope that we keep feeding into each other's knowledge spoon as we go forward. And I hope that we are all connected in a very, very productive way over the years to come, because as we said at the first cohort's convocation, at your convocation, this is only the beginning. So this is still the first chapter being written of our sustainability drives, and I hope that that chapter carries on for some time before we move on to the second one. Thank you again, each of you. I know that this is a cause of celebration. All of you probably need a drink now, but thank you for joining in, and thank you for taking out the time. Thank you for making it seem like each one of your talks was a lecture in itself, and that's the amount of effort you put into each of it. And I hope that those efforts keep happening as well in your field of study or passion or whatever you do take up, even if it's just about going to a separate country altogether, as one of us probably does want to. Okay, so that being said, over to you, Srishti. I've taken a lot more of the time than I intended to, and I know that we've gone overboard, so maybe we could just conclude now. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Ishan, for those words. Thank you so much. And I mean, yeah, with this, we've actually come to the end of this UN Habitat event. It was of course a very celebrated event, and we've of course been gearing up for this. The entire team of GPODS and the panelists as well. So of course, thank you so much for all the people who joined and who found the time to come here and attend the session. Thank you so much for that. Thank you so much for the panelists for brainstorming these brilliant ideas on board. Thank you so much for making this a very convenient job for me. It is just because of you all that we've made this a successful event. So thank you so much. If you guys have any closing thoughts, then you're of course free to share them over here. And with that, of course, we will then shut it off. Any closing thoughts, the panelists, anyone?
I would like to just quip that it's an interconnected web of problems, and it requires a spirit of inquiry, and it's not something that we can solve in isolation, as Ishan mentioned. So yes, so it's not an easy problem to solve. So yeah, it takes a lot of collaboration, discussion, and rallying people to action. Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you, all of you. I know that all of you have to be elsewhere as well. Thank you for devoting time, effort, everything into the studies, into preparing those Mentimeter questions, all of those things that you have done, the creative ways of engaging everyone. It has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.